Hi, now that we have seen attributes, let's start to look at methods. Remember that a class can contain any number of methods. Alright, now we are interested in what we call instance methods in this segment. Okay, not static methods, okay, which is beyond the scope for this session. So instance methods. Now in part 1, we are going to talk about three things. The first thing is that methods represent behavior. Another term for methods is functions. Especially if you have been a C programmer, they use the term functions. Okay, in object-oriented programming languages, we use the term methods instead of functions, but basically they're the same thing. So methods represent behavior or functionality, meaning methods of a class represent what you can do with an instance of the class. Okay, let me rephrase that. Instance methods of a class represent what you can do with an instance of the class. And in contrast, instant variables represent data or state of the instance. Let me give an example. Let's go back to our player example. So our player class has got two attributes or two instance variables called ID and endurance. Now ID and endurance both will store values. It represent internal data of a particular instance of player. On the other hand, the other methods like get endurance, set endurance, get ID, set ID, is dead, suffer wound, heal fully, heal. All these are functionality, what you can do with an instance of a player. Okay, this functionality or methods can be called or invoked by a user, by someone who is using the player object or the player instance. Alright. That is why instant variables are usually private. As you can see here, usually they are declared as private, and most methods, not all, are declared public. Okay, public. Now this is not always the case. Methods can be protected, can be default, can be private. There are private methods. Okay, methods which can only be called within the same class. In other words, called by other methods in the same class. Those are private methods. Okay, but public methods are what basically expose functionality to the rest of the world. Okay, anyone can call a public method. So a public method is something like a service which an instance provides to the rest of the world. And methods are the ways through which the world interacts with a particular instance. Okay, let's move on to the formal syntax of a method. Alright, so we have the accessibility modifier. As I mentioned, there are 4 levels of accessibility as far as methods and instance variables are concerned, but we are only interested in private and public at this point in time. So the keyword here is either public or private. This is followed by special modifiers. Now there are 3 special modifiers: final, static, and abstract. Now at this point in time, out of scope, we are not going to talk about special modifiers. Alright. The return type. Now this is what a method returns. Now a method, I'll show a diagram later to show that a method can be viewed as a system which returns something. So in here we put the method, the return type of the method. That means what will the method return? Is it an int? Is it a double? Is it a string? Or if it doesn't return anything, just put void there. VOID. That is a return type. Of course, that's followed by the method name and a pair of round brackets. Now, within the pair of round brackets, we have any number of input parameters Optional. Okay, if you have more than one input parameters, we use commas to separate them. We'll take a look at an example later and things will be much clearer. Open curly brace, close curly brace. Between a pair of curly braces will be the method's body. Okay, you can have any number of statements there. Okay, so let's take a look at an example to explain this. So you have to kind of memorize the syntax. After coding for some time, you get really used to it. Let's take a look at this method. Now this method is called setEndurance. So according to the syntax, this is the accessibility modifier, public or private. Public means anyone can call or invoke this method. Return type. I mentioned just now that we are not going to use any accessibility modifiers, so there won't be static, final, or abstract here. Alright, so void is the return type. This method returns nothing. Okay, this is the method name. This is the input parameter. This particular method takes in an int. Only one input parameter. Now you can have multiple input parameters. So for example, I can do this. Now this method would take in an int followed by a string. Okay, so you can have 3 input parameters, comma something, maybe a double value, whatever. Alright, okay, let's go back to the original. Now this method called getID takes in nothing, no input parameters. IsDate takes in nothing. Okay, now so let's go back to setEndurance. Open curly brace, close curly brace. Okay, between the two curly braces will be the content of the method. There's only one statement in setEndurance in this example, line 34. It does something inside and it returns. Now if you do not have a return statement, okay, Java will insert a return statement for you at the end of the method. So a method which returns nothing, you can just have a return statement like that. Okay, but it's really optional. It is understood that when the program runs to the last statement in the method, you return. On the other hand, if you have a method such as getID in this case, which has a return type, okay, you can have code within the method, any number of statements, but there must be a return statement which returns something, and that something must be a string object, or put it another way, it must be the address of a string object or null. Alright, it must match the return type specified in the method. By the way, this thing is what we call the method signature, all the way to the open curly brace, the method signature. Okay, just by looking at the method signature, okay, which I've highlighted, you can tell a lot about the method. You can tell that this method is public. You can tell that it returns a string. You can tell the name of the method is getID, and of course you can tell that in this case there are no input parameters. Okay, the signature tells a lot about the method. Okay, just by looking at the signature, you will know how to interact with the method. Now let me show a diagram. Okay, to illustrate, a method can be viewed as a system. Okay, what does a system do? It takes in something, inputs. It does something inside, and it returns, or it produces an output. So a method can be viewed as a system, or a box, which optionally takes in something. It may take in one input, it may take in 2 inputs. Alright, and the inputs will be here, the input parameters. In this case, getID takes in nothing. In this case, setEndurance takes in one input, which is an integer. Okay, in this case, setID takes in one input as well, which is a string. Okay, isDate takes in no inputs. Now sufferWound takes in one input. The input is an integer. Okay, so that is input thing. Now what about output? Now methods can only return 0 or 1 output. Methods can only return 0 or 1 output. Alright, and if a method returns nothing, we just specify the output as void. If it returns something, we specify the type of the value returned. So in this case, sufferWound returns nothing. There's an input, an integer, it does something inside, and it returns nothing. There's no output. Let's look at another example. isDate takes in nothing, no input, but it returns a boolean. That means it returns either true or false. Okay. Another example, this method called setID takes in one input, a string, and it returns nothing. setEndurance takes in an integer, one input, and returns nothing. On the other hand, getID takes in nothing, but it returns a string. Okay, so just by looking at the method signature, you can tell a lot about the method. What it takes in, okay, how many items it takes in, and what it returns. Does it return nothing, void, or does it return a string, or does it return an int or a boolean? Okay, so you can view a method as, you know, a box which does something. Now, what is inside? What is inside will be the method's body. Okay, the code inside. The code inside. You can have any number of lines of code inside a method. Okay, but generally you should keep methods short. Alright, if you have too many lines of code, if you have, I don't know, more than 50 or even more than 50 lines of code in a method, it probably means the method is trying to do too much. So as a general rule of thumb, you want to keep your methods short. Alright, if your method does a lot of things, you may want to have other methods. You may want to break up the task into smaller subtasks, and each subtask is actually done by another method. So putting code in a method is very nice because of two reasons. First reason, alright, abstraction. In other words, as far as a caller of the method is concerned, someone who uses the method is concerned, you do not have to bother about what goes on inside. The person who writes the method needs to fill in the body of the method. But the user of the method only needs to know what to pass in, okay, and what is expected as output. So what happens inside the method is abstracted from the user of the method. That is very nice. And of course, the second nice thing about methods is reusability. Okay, if you package code in a method, that code is reusable. You just have to call the method. You can call a method any number of times. Alright, for example, you can have a method called a simple one called, let me give an example, a quick silly example here, called product, okay, which takes in two values, two doubles actually. Okay, so the name of the method is called product. This is a quick revision. Accessibility, public, anyone can call it. It returns a double, a single value. Now it takes in two doubles. Alright, and what does it return? It returns the product of the two inputs. So it's reusable in the sense that every time you want to find the product of two numbers, of two double values, just call the product method and pass in the two numbers as input values. Okay, pass the two values into the method and it returns the double. Of course, this is a very simple example. The method can be very much more complex. You can have a lot of statements inside here. Okay. So let's move on to how to call a method. You call or invoke a method in order to use it. During the invocation or during the method call, you have to pass in the correct number of input elements. Correct? So the parameters in the method signature, this one, the input parameters in the method signature, I'm going to talk about the parameters versus the arguments in a calling statement. Okay, this is best explained using an example, which I will show very soon. When you call a method, the calling statement's arguments must match the method's parameters. Okay, otherwise there will be a problem, right? So back to our code. Now let's choose a method. Okay, let's get rid of constructors for now. Constructors are very special methods, which is a topic to be discussed later. Now there is a method called get endurance. Okay, how do I call the get endurance method? This is player test with a main method. Okay, I've created a new player object stored in a variable called p1. Here I'm calling the get ID method. Alright, the get ID method here, which returns a string. And what is it? What is returned? The value stored in ID. ID is the instance variable. So the value stored in ID, in this case, is null. Remember, by default, ID stores null because you didn't give the default value. Then I call the get endurance method, p1.getEndurance. Okay, remember, you cannot just do this. This is illegal. Why? Now, when you say call get ID like that, you're not sure, the compiler is not sure, yeah, which get ID you want. Are you calling get ID of this instance of player? Okay, because you can have p2, which is another instance of player. So that's why we call these instance methods. They belong to a particular instance of player. Okay, just calling get ID does not make sense. You do not know get ID of which instance. So you must say call get ID of this instance of player. Call get ID of this instance of player. Alright? Okay, so this is how we call methods. Now I was saying that what you pass in, this statement is a calling statement. You're trying to invoke a method. What you pass in must match the parameters in the method signature of getID. So in this case, I'm passing in nothing. Let's examine the getID method. It takes in nothing. Perfect match. No problem. Okay. What about set endurance? Now set endurance, according to the method signature, takes in an integer. So when I call set endurance like this, p2.setEndurance, I need to pass in an integer. Okay, this is the calling statement. Now, by the way, these are what we call arguments. Arguments, as opposed to parameters. On the methods side, we call them parameters. On the calling statement side, we call this arguments. So the arguments must match the parameters on the other side. In this case, when I call set endurance, I pass in an integer. If you look at the method signature of set endurance, yes, it takes in a integer. And here, this variable, this is actually a variable name, okay, called endurance, will store the address. Not, what am I saying? Okay, endurance will store the value which is passed over, 70 in this case. So endurance is a local variable which makes sense only between these two curly braces. It's a local variable, and it stores 70 in this case when you call set endurance and pass in 70. Okay, I'm going to change this a bit. I'll call this E. Okay, because I'm going to talk about this dot much later. Let me change the change the code a bit. Okay, I'll explain why very soon. Yep, there's only two things I need to change here. Yep. Okay. Do I have another example? Okay, let's show another example. Now, for example, suffer wound takes in an integer. So when I call suffer wound, I must say, who should I call? I'll do something like p2.suffer wound, and I pass in an integer, suffer wound 30. Now, what does suffer wound do? Okay, the endurance of p2 is set to 70, and I call suffer wound. Suffer wound basically, when it's invoked, damage here will store the value 30, okay, which is passed over. So this statement invokes the suffer wound method of p2, passes 30 over. Okay, 30 damage will store 30, local variable damage will store 30. It comes in here and it does endurance equals to endurance minus 30. So original value in endurance is 70. 70 minus 30 is 40. So the new value stored in endurance will become 40. Endurance is an instance variable which belongs to that instance we are dealing with now, P2. So there's an if block here which checks if endurance is below 0, I will set endurance back to 0. Okay, this is to prevent endurance from becoming negative, which apparently does not make sense in this business scenario. And then it will return. Okay, remember, if there's no return statement in a method which returns void, Java will just insert the return semicolon statement at the end. Okay, now if your method is supposed to return something, for example, in this case, isDate is supposed to return a boolean, you cannot assume that Java will insert something, a return statement for you, because you need to explicitly tell Java what value needs to be returned. In this case, no value needs to be returned, so this return statement is optional. Okay, so let's try and run this and see if it works as expected. I'm dealing with P2. Let's get rid of P1. I'm not interested in P1 in this case. Okay, so Peter, player 2, P2, will have an endurance of 70. You get a wound, alright. As a result, I will expect this to print 40. Let's see if this works as expected. Yep, everything works as expected. So this is methods. Remember, when you call a method, what it will pass in must match the signature. Let me show an example if it doesn't match. For example, suffer wound is supposed to take an integer, right? If I pass in nothing, I just save it. Let's try to compile it. Let's take a look at the compilation error. Okay, line 7, it says line 7. Okay, this is line 7. Error. The method suffer wound in the class player cannot be applied to the given types. You get an error, compilation error which looks like that. What does it mean? What is required? It requires an int to be passed in between the round brackets. But what is found? No arguments. Actual and formal argument lists differ in length, and this is the error. Okay, so I'll get something similar if I pass in something dumb. I pass in a string. Now, suffer wound is not supposed to take in a string. Okay, if I compile, I get a compilation error as well. On line 7, the same line. What is required? An int. What is found? A string. Okay. Another example, if I pass in two things, a string, comma, an int, same error. Okay, required int, found, actually it should be a string, comma, and int. Alright. Okay, so that's the end of this session. In the next session, I'll talk more about methods.